Hello chess lovers and welcome to Chess Insight! In today's video, we'll explore a truly fascinating game from the 1966 World Chess Championship, a battle between the reigning world champion, Tigran Petrosian, and his challenger, Boris Spassky. This was Game 7 out of 24, and Petrosian would go on to defend his title, which he had won 3 years earlier. In this game, Spassky played the white pieces, and Petrosian had the black pieces. The game started with Spassky advancing his pawn to d4. Petrosian replied by developing his knight to f6. Then white brought out the knight to f3, followed by black pushing the pawn to e6. White continued with bishop to g5, pinning the knight. Black responded with pawn to d5, establishing control of the center. This opening setup is known as the Torre attack, specifically the classical defense variation. White developed his knight to d2, and black brought out his bishop to e7. Next, white played pawn to e3, black developed the other knight to d7, and white placed his dark-squared bishop on d3, preparing for kingside castling. At this point, Petrosian challenged the center with pawn to c5. Spassky reinforced the center with pawn to c3, and black responded with pawn to b6, aiming to build a pawn chain and prepare to develop his light-squared bishop to b7. By move 8, Spassky castled kingside. Petrosian developed his bishop to b7, and white jumped in with his knight to e5, offering a trade. Black accepted. Knight captures knight, and white recaptured with his pawn, attacking the knight on f6. To avoid the attack, Petrosian moved his knight to d7, putting pressure on the e5 pawn and subtly offering an exchange of dark-squared bishops. Spassky declined and pulled his bishop back to f4, defending the pawn. Next, Petrosian placed his queen on c7, increasing pressure on the central pawn and preparing to castle on the queenside. Spassky supported the pawn with his knight jumping to f3. Petrosian responded with pawn to h6, preparing to kick out the dark-squared bishop. White pulled it back to g3, anticipating a push of pawn to g5. In this position, Spassky came up with a brilliant idea, sacrificing the pawn on b4. His idea was, if black captures the pawn with c takes b4, white can recapture with the a pawn, opening the c-file and making it more difficult for black to castle on the queen side. However, Petrosian didn't take the bait. Instead, he advanced his h-pawn to h5, planning to trap the bishop. Spassky responded with pawn to h4, and after black captured the pawn with h takes g4, white didn't recapture. Instead, he calmly played bishop to f4, continuing to support his central pawn. Why didn't white take the pawn on g4? Because if he did, black's pawns would remain connected and active on the king side, creating attacking chances. For example, if white plays bishop captures on h4, then black plays bishop takes bishop, followed by knight takes bishop, and now queen captures on e5, attacking the c3 pawn. This would give black a material and positional advantage. So instead, bishop to f4 was the better choice. Petrosian then castled queenside, and white continued with pawn to a4, beginning a pawn storm to break through black's queenside defense. At move 17, Petrosian took almost 20 minutes to think, and eventually played pawn to c4, attacking the bishop. The bishop retreated to e2, and black pushed pawn to a6, a critical move to stop white from continuing the advance with a5. If white pushed pawn to a5, black would reply with pawn to b5. If white then pushed pawn to b5, black would counter with pawn to a5, sealing the queenside and creating a fortress around his king. In the actual game, Spassky moved his king to h1, preparing to shift his rook to the g-file. Black placed a rook on g8, a semi-open file targeting the g2 pawn. White responded by moving his rook to g1, reinforcing the defense. Then black lifted his rook to the 4th rank on g4, setting up to double his rooks. White played queen to d2, and Petrosian brought the second rook to g8. White pushed pawn to a5, offering a pawn exchange. Black refused and pushed pawn to b5, building a strong pawn chain. This structure limited white's options, especially for his bishops, which were now very passive. White played rook to d1, and black repositioned his bishop to f8. Then came a questionable move from white, knight to h2, aiming to attack the rook on g4. A typical player might have pulled the rook back, but Petrosian had other plans. He sacrificed the knight on e5 by capturing the central pawn. He allowed white to take the rook, and if that happened, black would recapture with the f-pawn, leaving 2 strong connected pawns right in front of white's king. White tried to distract black with pawn to e4, hoping for an impulsive capture, but Petrosian calmly played bishop to d6, followed by white playing queen to e3. Petrosian once again avoided the temptation and instead developed his knight to d7, inviting a trade of bishops. White accepted. Bishop takes bishop. Black recaptured with the queen. White then played rook to d4, pressuring the g4 pawn. His idea was to later play pawn takes pawn on d5 and win the g4 pawn with his rook. But Petrosian blocked the idea with pawn to e5, attacking the rook. White retreated the rook to d2, and black followed with pawn to f5. By move 30, all of black's pawns were still intact, a rare and impressive sight. Petrosian was now ready to launch a dangerous pawn storm, taking over key squares in white's territory. The best response from white would have been pawn takes pawn on f5, but instead he played pawn takes on d5. This allowed Petrosian to advance his f-pawn to f4, attacking the queen. Spassky moved the queen to e4, but this was a slight inaccuracy. Petrosian developed his knight to f6, attacking both the queen and the e4 pawn. White checked with queen to f5, and black calmly played king to b8. In this position, the move recommended by the engine is to bring the bishop back to d1. Suppose black plays bishop captures the pawn. In response, white can immediately eliminate black's bishop. Then black plays knight captures rook, followed by white's bishop capturing the pawn on g4, and finally black's knight recapturing the pawn. Even with this variation, white would still struggle to equalize the position. That's because black holds a significant pawn majority, and more importantly, a dangerous passed pawn, one that will be extremely difficult for white to stop in the long run. Now let's return to the actual game. Here, white's best move would have been bishop to d1, but instead he played pawn to f3, trying to weaken black's pawn formation. Petrosian answered with bishop to c8, threatening the queen. White moved the queen to b1, and Petrosian pushed pawn to g3. White replied with rook to e1, and Petrosian followed with pawn to h3, threatening the g2 pawn. White defended with bishop to f1, and Petrosian placed his rook on h8. White then captured the h3 pawn, and black recaptured with the bishop. Now black had a dangerous threat, a discovered check using the g3 pawn. White moved his king to g1, and black immediately captured the bishop on h4. After white's king recaptured the bishop, black pushed pawn to e4. If white captured this pawn, black would play pawn to f3, then rook to h1, and mate would be inevitable in just a few moves. So Spassky didn't take the pawn. He played queen to d1, hoping to hold on, but Petrosian found a brilliant sacrifice, knight to g4. White captured the knight with the f-pawn. But what if he didn't? Suppose white played pawn takes pawn on e4, then black would play knight to e3, a skewer against the king and rook. Eventually, black would regain material and increase pressure. Back in the actual game, after white captured the knight, Petrosian pushed pawn to f3, threatening rook to h1 checkmate. If white tried to run with the king to g1, black would simply play queen to h6, and checkmate would be unstoppable within 4 moves. White played rook to g2 to defend. But after pawn captures rook, Spassky resigned on move 43. If the game had continued, black would check with rook to h2, white's king would go to g1, and then queen to h6 would follow, and checkmate would be inevitable. What a brilliant performance by Tigran Petrosian. This game is a perfect example of deep positional understanding, strategic pawn play, and brilliant tactical execution. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.